This video is going to be a quick demonstration of our first exercise on basic shape building and an introduction to Adobe Illustrator. So when you download the exercise file and open it up, you should be looking at a screen similar to this. My UI is really big here because I'm hoping it makes it easier for you to see. But if it doesn't look like this, or if you ever end up in a space where you've lost your toolbar or something, you can always go up to Window and then go to Workspace. And I'm using Essentials Classic. This is what I recommend we use in this class, just so we're all on the same page. If this is not checked, you can check it here, or you can always reset your workspace, and the workspace will end up as it originally was. So just to give you kind of an example of that, I'm gonna make some things wonky here so you can see the kind of trouble you can get yourself into if you end up moving some stuff around. So you can see here I don't have any of my tools. If I go to Window, Workspace, Reset Essentials Classic, I end up with all my stuff back. So as we go through this exercise, I will kind of explain the tools as we go and as you need them. There's about a billion things in the Adobe programs, and you'll only need like 10% of them. So I think it makes sense for us to cover things kind of as we go. Okay, so if you've read the exercise file, you'll see that the point here is, let me zoom in, and I'm doing that with either the magnifying glass tool and I click and drag to the right or left, or the shortcut is Z. I also sometimes like to use the Alt key and then the scroll wheel if you're using a mouse, which I recommend, but that's besides the point. The point of this exercise is to recreate the shapes on each one of these artboards, following kind of the instructions at the top. So you can see here we're supposed to create a square with a solid fill and no stroke, and we can use the dotted lines to kind of trace that out. An artboard, as it's mentioned in the instructions, is kind of Illustrator's way or wording to denominate like a sheet of paper, which you can see by the white outlines here. We can take a look at those using our artboards panel over here in the layers panel, and you can see each one of these white sheets is its own artboard. You can make your own artboards using the artboard tool over here. And if you click and hover over any of these tools, you'll see you can get the name, the shortcut, and then kind of a demonstration of what it does. Just to show you, so if I click and drag, I can make a new sheet any way that I want. You can also adjust the width and height of this to specific dimensions by punching in the numbers up here. So if we wanted a artboard that was 500 by 500 like the rest of these, I could type that in and you can see this is an exact copy of those. You won't need to do that here because I've already made all the artboards for you, so all we need to do is to start making the shapes. To do that, it would probably help if we talked about how to move around the space here. So I commonly like to use my middle mouse button, which lets me click and drag. You can also use the hand tool over here, which the shortcut is H, to pan around the screen. And if you hold space and click and drag, it does the same thing. We talked about zoom, but just again, it's the magnifying glass, click and drag to the right to zoom in, left to zoom out. Or you can use Alt and scroll in and out. Okay, let's get started. So the first artboard here says to make a square with a solid fill and no stroke. So I can grab my rectangle tool over here in the left toolbar, which is M is the shortcut on the keyboard. And when I click and drag that, you'll see that I get expectedly a rectangle. We can make sure this is a square by holding Shift anytime we scale a shape, and it will constrain the proportions to always be equal on both sides. So you can see if I hold Shift, I get a perfect square. If I release Shift, I can make a rectangle of various sorts. So I'm just going to line this up on the edge here. It doesn't really matter for this exercise. The point is to work with the tools. But to keep things neat, I'm going to click and I'm holding on that point, and then I'm going to hold Shift on my keyboard and click and drag out. You can see the shape is selected. So if I want to deselect it, I typically switch back to the selection tool and just click off of it. So now we have a black square with a solid fill and no stroke. What are fills and strokes? We are going to talk about that in the second one here. So for this shape, we are doing a circle with no fill, but a solid stroke that is any color besides black. So the first thing to do is to find out how to make a circle, which if you click and hold on some of the tools over here, if they have a little white arrow in the corner, you will get additional tools underneath. So if I click and hold on the rectangle tool, you'll see that the ellipse tool is hiding underneath of it. So I'm clicking and holding, and then if I release on that, I now have the ellipse tool. The shortcut for that is to use L on your keyboard, and it works the same way as the rectangle tool. So if I click and drag, it's unconstrained, but if I hold Shift, I get a perfect circle. While we're at it, I'm going to show you one other tip about drawing and scaling things, and that is how to scale things from the center. So you can see here, this can be kind of tricky because we don't have a solid corner to scale this on if we were trying to make this the exact same size as the other one. So I could, kind of eyeball this to make sure that I'm lining up with the side of this and the top of this, but it might be easier to scale it from the center. So I can click and drag from the center, and if I hold the Alt key, rather than scaling from the corner of the shape, it scales from the center of the shape. So now we have a perfect circle. The next step is to give ourselves a stroke and remove the fill. You can see over here in the Properties panel, anytime you have something selected, it tells you some information about it, including the fill and the stroke under the Appearance. You can also find that information over here on the left underneath your tools. The first square here will tell you what the fill color is, and the second will tell you the stroke color. You can double click on either of these to change that. So for example, I could change this to pink by double clicking on that and changing it to pink. The same works for the stroke. So to add a stroke, I can change this color to, let's go with red. Oops, that's white. There's a red. And then it's difficult to see, it's there, but it's difficult to see because the stroke weight is only 1 point. I can increase that weight using the up and down arrows on the points over here, and you'll see as that number gets higher, the thickness of the stroke increases. And you can do the same thing up here in the top panel. So the next thing we need to do is to get rid of the fill here. So you'll see I could click on the fill and click none. The same thing over here in the Tools panel. But the shortcut for adding or removing a fill is to hit / on your keyboard. So if I have this ellipse selected and then I hit /, that disappears. Another nice shortcut to know is to swap these colors. You can use this icon or hit Shift and X. X will swap whether you have the fill or the stroke selected. Okay, so now we have a circle with no fill and a solid stroke of any color besides black. Let's move on to the next one here. Here we are creating a triangle with a dashed stroke. So we could look for triangle underneath our shape tools by clicking and holding over here, but you'll see there is no triangle shape. So we are going to select a polygon because the triangle is a polygon, and we will learn how to make shapes of different numbers of sides. So if you have the polygon tool selected and you click and drag out, you'll see that I get, depending on the last shape you used, a polygon of a different number of sides. If I hit the up and down arrows on my keyboard, you'll see that I can add additional sides or remove them. So if I hit the down arrow key a couple times, you'll see that I can draw a triangle. And I can use the selection tool to drag that over here, and then grab the corner and hold shift to scale that up to match the right size. Now, just like we used our stroke properties over here to change the weight and the color of our stroke, we can also use it to change the appearance of our stroke. So I can click on that, the name stroke, and you'll see I get some additional options here. One of them here is dashed lines. So if I hit that checkbox, you'll see the stroke now becomes dashed. And you can adjust this here too. This is how you would get something like a dotted line if you needed a dotted line, but for our cases here, this dash stroke is all we need. Our next one here is some additional practice with a pentagon. So just like our triangle, I can click and drag out, and then use my up arrow key to get up to 5 sides. This one doesn't specify if it should be filled or dashed, so you are free to experiment, make it whatever you want. I think I'll just leave mine as a red pentagon, and we'll call that one done. Next is a quadrilateral with a narrow base, and this is going to be our first one where we start using some additional tools besides the shape tool. So I'm going to click and drag here, and I'm going to start with a rectangle because it's pretty close to a rectangle. I'm going to switch this back to black just so it's a little easier to look at. I'll start in the corner here and click and drag without holding shift so that this is not a perfect square. And then we need to figure out how to narrow this base here. To do this, you can see I can try to grab the corners here, except using the selection tool, this only lets me scale the shape, or if I click inside, I can round the corners. To actually move some of the points on a shape or on a path, we need to use a second selection tool, which is called the direct selection tool. So this is the white arrow in our toolbar, and the shortcut to get there is to hit A on the keyboard. The direct selection tool lets you grab things that are in a group or individual points on a shape or a path. So if I first select the shape, you'll see I now can select these anchor points. So if I select one of these, you'll see this point is filled and the others are not. And now I can click and move this anchor point to create some more interesting shapes. You can also use your arrow keys to nudge these around. So if I just hit the left arrow key, it moves by, I think 1 pixel at a time is what I have this set as now. If I hold shift, it will bump it over by, I think, 10 at a time. So I'm just going to grab both these points and scooch them in by holding shift. And that's a little messy, so I'm going to swap this to a stroke so I can see what I'm doing. Then I'm using my direct selection tool. I'm going to scoot these in so that they're a little more even. And there is our quadrilateral with a narrow base. Okay, time to get a little more interesting. We are going to talk about creating some unique shapes by using the shape building functions and the path finding functions in Illustrator. So this one is to make a half circle. So we know how to make a circle. I could scale this up, create a perfect circle. And the next thing I would need to do is to try and get rid of this bottom half. You can kind of fake stuff like this in a pinch if you need to by simply covering things up and changing the colors. And oftentimes if you're working in like PowerPoint or something, not in a design software, that's how you can do some shape building. But we have some more interesting functions in Illustrator or Figma, which I will show you in a separate video. So just like we saw by kind of faking it, essentially the half circle is a circle that we have covered up half of it with a rectangle or another straight shape of some sort. We are going to use the shape building functions in Illustrator quite a bit in this exercise, and they're super handy. This is what I use probably half the time that I'm using Illustrator. So if I select both of these shapes, and then I come over here to my properties, when I have multiple shapes selected, you'll see an option called Pathfinder. And there's a few different options here. The first one is to unite. The second is to subtract the front shape from the back shape. And these little icons kind of depict what each of these options does. So if I click Unite, you'll see it combines those into a single shape where everything is overlapping. I'm going to undo that with Control or Command Z. And the one we want is actually the second option, which is minus front. So subtracting the front from the back will give us a clean cut halfway across the circle. And you'll see we now have a half circle. Another little hint here is oftentimes I will not use the Pathfinder. Instead, I'll use this really versatile tool we have called the Shape Builder tool. So this is the two little dotted circles over here in the toolbar. And the shortcut to get there is Shift M on the keyboard. Now, you'll see I can't do anything with this now because I have nothing selected. So I first need to select my shapes and then select the Shape Builder. And you'll see when I hover over shapes that have overlapping paths, it gives me a little halftone pattern to tell me what I have selected. And there's a plus on my cursor, which means that it will unite anything that I click and drag over. So I could unite everything by clicking and dragging all the way through all the shapes. So this would do the same thing that unite did. And then if I hold Alt, you'll see that that plus switches to a minus and I can subtract parts of the shape. So now I can click and drag through the parts of my rectangle and I end up with a half circle. We can do a similar thing to create a square with a missing circle in the middle. So first, I'll draw my square. And then I'm going to swap colors to something else. I'm using the eyedropper tool. Well, let me switch to my circle tool first and deselect the square. Then if I use the eyedropper tool, this is a handy way to quickly select a different color. So I could select white and it'll swap my fill to white. And now when I draw my circle, it is white. Now, if I want this to look like our guide here, this circle needs to be perfectly in the center of the square. There's a couple ways we can get there. So I can click and drag slowly and you'll see that it will give me what are called smart guides in the pink. That will tell me when this is in the center of the shape. The faster and smarter way to do these aligning sort of tasks is to use the align function in Illustrator. So you'll see if I have anything selected, it will give me alignment options, and the default is to align to the artboard. So if let's select our square so we can see this more easily, align this to the left. By default, it will align to the artboard on the left, in the middle, on the top. You get the idea. This is usually most handy when we are trying to align multiple things together. So if I click and drag with my selection tool and I select both the square and the circle, you'll see this align option switches to align to selection, which means, hey, align these things together that I have selected. So I'm going to use a combination of horizontally aligning the center and then vertically aligning the center. And you'll see those switch. And I'll make that a little more obvious. So you'll see that switches them to the center and then scooches them both that way. Now, another thing to note here is sometimes you have an object where you want it and you don't want to move this shape. You only want to move the other shape. So I have both of these selected. If I hold Shift and then click my square, oops. Actually, it's not Shift. If I have both of them selected, and then I just click on the object that I want to be kind of the key object or the master object, it gets a darker line around it. And now when I align things, only the circle aligns to the square. So that is how we do that. Let's move on to the bottom row and talk about the radius of corners. So now we're making a square with a single rounded corner. I'm going to click and hold on my circle, grab the rectangle tool, start at the bottom corner and use Shift to drag up. And I'm going to change this color to black. And then just like before you saw, if I click and drag on these little circles near the corners, that changes the corner radius. But we don't want to change all the corners, we just want to change that top right corner. So I can use my direct selection tool and click to just grab this point. And now when I click and drag this in, it just changes the radius of the corner that I have selected. So you can see how a combination between all the different tools that we're using, we can get some pretty interesting shapes. Let's move over to working with the combined diamonds. So a diamond, as we have it here, looks like just a square that has been rotated 45 degrees. So we can rotate by hovering over the corner of a shape until we get the little rotation tool, and it will give you the degrees by your cursor. If you hold Shift, this will constrain it to, by default, it's 45 or 90 degree angles. So I could get a perfect diamond in that way. And then if I wanted a second diamond, you can use copy paste just like you can in other softwares, but you will oftentimes find it handy to hold Alt, and you'll see my cursor switches to two cursors. And when I click and drag out from an object, I get copies of it. So by using that in combination with the Shift key, I can constrain this to move directly down. And you'll see I get a smart guide when it's aligned to the center. And we have our overlapping diamonds, but they are not united yet. So this time let's use the Unite option in Pathfinder. And now this is all one shape. Okay, circle with a piece missing. So we know how to use our circle tool. I'm going to hit L on the keyboard. I'm going to use this guide in the center along with Alt to scale it up perfectly to the right size. And then I'm going to use M to grab a square and change the color so we can kind of see what's going on. I will often change the color of the things I'm working with just to see and then change them to what they need to be afterwards. That's just a handy tip as you're working. So if I draw a square and scale it out from the center, you'll see that this shape becomes what we're looking for. So here I'm going to use the shape builder, Shift M, or this tool over here. I hold Alt to get to minus, and I'll click and drag through both of those shapes until we're left with our circle with a piece missing. The star tool actually has its own option under shapes. So I can click and drag up. That's how we make a star. There's some other options in here. If I click and drag and then I hold Control, Control will change how deep sort of the points on that star are. So if we wanted a very pointy star, we could drag them out like that. If we wanted something a little more mild, I could just hold Control and scale it until it looks the way I want it to. So that is the star tool. Overlapping circles that are filled with the center missing. So this, again, you can use your handy shape builder tool. I'm also going to show you here how to use one of the other Pathfinder options. So let's start with our 2 circles. Change the color here so we can see. In fact, no, that works fine. Okay, so if I select both of these, you'll see that we have our overlapping part of the Venn diagram here. I could use the shape builder and just subtract the center there. We could also use this last option, which is exclude, in our Pathfinder. And that will just exclude the center of the shape and leave the rest as one shape. A petal shape, so there's a few ways we could do this. The easiest way is probably the reverse of what we just did with the overlapping circles. So I could create one big circle here, and then another big circle over here. I'm going to swap my fill and my stroke so I have an easier time seeing that overlap. Maybe I'll scale these down a bit. Just nudging these around to get closer to the shape I want. And then we could use our Pathfinder option that is intersect, which will only leave us with the center of those. Of course, you could also use my favorite tool and use the shape builder, hold Alt and click on the sections you don't want, and you'll be left with the same thing. Circle with triangles missing. So let's start with a perfect circle. And then let's grab our polygon tool, and I'll have to use the arrow keys to get to a triangle, and then I'm holding shift just to make sure that the rotation on this is perfectly level. Let's make that black so we can see. And here let's start to talk about groups of shapes. So we could use the Pathfinder tool a few times in a row. So if I make copies of this, you know, I could go through and subtract the front, and keep going, but that's pretty slow. It makes sense here for us to talk about grouping shapes together. So if I select all my triangles, one option is to right-click and go to Group. We could also use Control-G to group them. And you'll see now when I click on one, all 3 of these are selected. So if I use the minus front now, it will subtract the whole front group from the back shape. And now I am left with the circle with the triangles missing. Okay, so that's all the shapes that we needed to draw here. The last step in the exercise is to export these as a PDF that you can edit later, and then also export your favorite artboard as a PNG so that you know how to change the file format that you're exporting in. To save our work in a PDF form, PDFs are nice because in vector graphics like Illustrator, you can go back in and edit them later. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and you'll see that this is the base file name. I'm going to switch this to Adobe PDF, and then I'm going to name this a standardized naming format that we should always use when delivering files to clients or in class. I'm going to use my last name and then put dash exercise 1, or exercise 2, I guess we're on. Hit save, and then it gives me some more options. The main one you want to pay attention to here is preserve Illustrator editing capabilities. This is what makes this a PDF that you can open up in Illustrator again to edit. So then I'll hit save, and it should naturally put each one of those artboards on a separate page. It's all combined in one file. So I'll just give that a second. In here it opens up a preview with all of the shapes that we drew. So this is one of the files that you'll need to turn in. The last one is to pick your favorite shape that you made. Maybe you played with colors or the stroke options and you made a composition that you really like, and to export that one as a PNG. So let's say that I want to export my double diamond shape. So a lot of different ways to export things from Illustrator. This is just my preferred way of getting things from artboards. I'm going to go to File, Export, Export for Screens, and then I like to use, you can see you can switch between assets if we made assets and artboards, and just select the artboards that you like, and you'll get separate files of those. So just make sure you're checking the things that you want. So I'm going to select the double diamonds. If you didn't, this is also a nice place to name your files or name your artboards. I can name this Muffet EX2. And then the file formats, you can change over here under formats, which will also, you can modify the scale since these are vector graphics, but 1 is fine here. PNG is fine here. You could also change it to, PDF or JPEG or whatever you need here. And then the location. Sometimes this will give you, by default, I think it gives you this option, create subfolders. I like to leave this off, or you're going to get a bunch of different folders for each different option that you export, and it can become harder to find your files. So let's go ahead and export this. Gonna drag that up a little. Screen is too big. Okay, so once both those files are exported, those are the two files you need to turn in, and hopefully through the course of this, you started to get a handle on some of the basic shapes and how to work with basic shapes to construct form, and how to use some of the basic tools in Illustrator.